Welcome to today's SANS webcast, 6 Steps to Effective ICS Threat Hunting, sponsored by Dragos. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Tim Conway, Technical Director, ICS and SCADA Programs at SANS, and he will be moderating today's webcast. He's also a SANS certified instructor. And then we also have Marc Seitz, Industrial Hunter, and Dan Gunter, Director, Research and Development, both at Dragos Threat Operations Center. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Tim.
Thank you very much, Carol, and good morning, afternoon to those who are joined on the call. I've been looking through the list of almost a couple hundred people joined here, and we have a good representation from around the world. So for some of you, this is evening hours, and for some of you, it's very, very early. So again, thanks for joining. In your GoToMeeting, you have an option for chat window, and you have an option for questions. Please make use of those. This webcast is going to be a little bit different. All of us on the webcast have done a number of webcasts through SANS, and they generally kind of walk through a passing of the baton model, where somebody kind of sets the stage and walks through and then passes the baton to another presenter and then to another presenter, and we handle questions at the end. Working with these two great presenters at Dragos, we definitely want this to be more of a discussion. We're going to run this whole webcast that way, and we're going to work through kind of 3 different topic areas. So as questions occur to you, please send them through, and I'll try to manage our time and your questions to get everything you're hoping to get answered addressed. With that, the organization, I think almost everybody on this call should be very, very familiar with Dragos, but with a company as large as it's grown to, I would like to just ask Dan and Marc to take a couple of minutes to tell us about their particular background and focus areas before we jump into these discussion topics. So with that, I'll start with Dan. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So my name is Dan Gunter. As Tim mentioned, I work for Dragos. As the title shows, I'm the Director of Research and Development. So Dragos is primarily a product-based company, so we produce a product for passive network monitoring in industrial environments. My role specifically is I lead the R&D efforts at Dragos. So everything from control system research on how buying and taking apart large control systems to figure out how they work, to the detection engineering piece of figuring out what an asset owner cares about, and then also how you tie that to detections for different types of threat actors, what they might do in the environment. Prior to R&D at Dragos, I was an analyst, and so I went out with asset owners, did everything from red teaming to threat hunting to incident response, the whole gambit of activities. Prior to Dragos, came from a DoD background, so was Air Force for a few years. I worked for the Air Force CERT, doing global response for the Air Force, and also working with Cybercom on a few of the Cybercom mission areas. So with that, I will kick over to Marc to talk about himself a little bit.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Marc Seitz, part of the Threat Operations Center here, and being an industrial hunter or threat analyst kind of all mixed together, I have essentially a background across almost every ICS vertical at this point, just from going to the network, assess what's going on, and then doing a variety of services on top of that, whether it be some sort of vulnerability assessments, whether it be a pure threat hunt. It's really taking those ideas and concepts that we're familiar with, and where I like to focus on that is how do we automate, how do we make ourselves more efficient, how do we take what we find out in the field and make it actionable for everybody else. So I've spent the better part of 2 years focusing on that here at Dragos, and kind of having the full flexibility to go across to electric, to food and beverage, to oil and gas, all sorts of verticals there. So that's a brief introduction there. Tim, back over to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I thought it was important to the audience just kind of walk through background so you can frame your questions, and more importantly than anything else, as you're dialing into these types of webcasts, to know for this particular one, there's no one on here with a sales background or with a sales function or purpose. So definitely come with your technical questions as you're looking at building out threat hunting capabilities or teams or looking at tools. Definitely try to ask those questions here so we can get them addressed and answered. As we were trying to think about what might be fun, how to build this webcast and walk through some topics, two things came up immediately. One of them being some papers that both of these gentlemen have worked on, submitted through SANS and through the reading room, and they've been highly talked about, downloaded, pursued. So we thought trying to capture what's covered in those two white papers would be of interest to the people on the phone. And a second topic where we're kind of looking for thoughts and framing around a piece that has not been written up yet in a paper, and we'll talk about that towards the end of this webcast. But the first paper in the reading room really focuses on kind of a need for a formal and common understanding of effective threat hunting, as a variety of different vendors or law enforcement intelligence organizations or kind of countrywide certs are using language and maybe not in consistent ways, and setting kind of expectations of applicability of some of the indicators that they're identifying. We really wanted to talk about a paper that has been written by both of our presenters in really an effort to try to pursue something better. So there's a common understanding across the industry, a common way of thinking about this, and really getting to a point where the approach that is being talked about has some level of rigor in it, and you can have faith and confidence in what somebody is saying if they followed that process. Second paper we're going to talk about is, so if you think of the first one more as a scientific or a research type of paper, the second paper more of an applied kind of a practical approach for conducting cyber threat hunts. We'll spend a good portion of the webcast talking about those two papers that exist. For anybody who has downloaded them, read them, if you have questions that are outstanding, please submit them. We'll get them asked while we're covering each one of those papers. And the third is really a paper that I believe needs to be written. I'm hoping to pursue it with both of these gentlemen and other contributors if they're interested, focusing on kind of the tools and techniques that are used by various asset owners and operators of different levels of maturity. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach here. Everybody doesn't have the same size problem, nor the same size budgets, or the same size of a team with similar capabilities. So there's not just one right way to do this. Really kind of trying to meet people where they're at and help them take the next step in a direction of being able to fight this battle better. We'll talk about that as we close. To begin with, we're going to start with this first paper, which shown on the screen here is kind of more of the scientific, academic pursuit of something better here. The hunting with rigor. The URL is listed on the screen. All these slides will be available at the end. But right out the bat, as you're reading this paper, you'll find references to a couple of different types of threat hunting. So threat focused and an environmental hunt. Along the line here, most of this is going to be discussion between myself and the other two panel members. But in some cases, we've tried to add one or two slides total to just kind of have on screen a clear message that's being communicated. But if we can begin, Dan or Marc, if either one of you can begin talking about the definition of how you kind of present the two different types of threat hunt that are presented in this paper, and how you distinguish between the two of them.
Yeah, certainly. And so where really this paper originated from was over the past 2 years, what we've done, what Marc and I have done together at Dragos, and how we've approached threat hunts. And so when we wrote this paper, a lot of the original genesis was realizing that industrial environments, you do have the whole physics on the other side of the computer. You have the whole consequence side of the control system. A lot of control systems are computers that are just driving parts of that process. And so when you approach them to threat hunt at the time, and Marc might chime in a second on this, we really saw two ways, or I saw two ways you could approach threat hunting in an industrial environment or in industrial settings. The first being the environment focus, so taking a technology focus. So I'm going to plan a threat hunt around how I know, or my understanding of how Emerson Innovation, how Honeywell Experion, pick your control system, of how that looks. And what I want to do in this threat hunt is kind of figure out, what does my terrain look like? A lot of times, particularly when you're talking about anomalies, but even threat detection, it kind of gets to this question of what's normal. And if you don't know what your plant looks like, if you don't know the expected communications between the industrial products, you can't really define what normal is, to even get anomalies or to get threat detection off of. And so for an environmental focused threat hunt, really the idea that we had with this is you're focusing on a particular product, or maybe even a part, if you're in a refinery, a part of the refining process, or whatever process you're in, picking a part of that. With this is where, as a defender, you can capitalize on the home field advantage, right? Because you can know your plant better than the attacker. And just knowing that, you're going to have a better opportunity to know, again, what that normal versus weird looks like. On the flip side, you might focus a hunt on the threat focus, and so it is threat hunting. But on this side, we're taking threat actor TTPs. So here at Dragos, we spend a lot of time both on our Intel team, our engineering team, and R&D team on looking at threat actor TTPs. You know, how does nation state X or nation state Y, how are they targeting industrial networks? What does it look like, and how can I essentially look for that? With this, one of the really genesis on this paper too, where Marc and I started, was there's a lot of good threat hunting resources out there. A lot start with hypothesis generation, and this is really taking threat hunting, trying to take back the practice of threat hunting one step to say, yes, hypothesis generation is important, but really you should take a step back and say, okay, within the context of my environment in the industrial network, what am I focusing that set of hypotheses on? Otherwise you just start with a hunt where it's like, I'm going to go look for PS exec, which is good, but you kind of want more of that why there, and we'll cover that a little later. But with threat focus too, this is where you can also differentiate TTPs. So when you talk about commonly shared open source tools that we know are being used against industrial environments, things like Mimikatz, Cobalt Strike, those type of tools. With this hunt, you can also begin to understand how the TTPs differentiate to say, hey, this looks like activity group X versus activity group Y based on how I know they use tools or how I know they use different techniques in the environment. So this is all to say that when we split down to this, we kind of view the two types of hunting when we wrote this paper as being either you're focused on that technology, how the control system works, or you're focused on that TTP side of let me go look for, nation state X or group wise TTPs.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add on top of that, where this is important from a definition perspective, is we've seen a lot of frustration even from our own team, or just when we go to perform, threat hunts inside of these environments. We'll be talking to other threat hunters or other threat hunt programs, and there's a frustration of, like, we don't know what the metrics look like. We don't necessarily know what we're looking for. We've just been given this sort of, the directive of, well, we need to do threat hunting, right? Without kind of breaking down the why or the how to get there, and essentially going straight into the threat side, the TTPs, rather than what is actually here, right? What is on my network? How do I defend what's here? Do I know what I'm actually looking at? And again, you're going to have a lot of frustration if you kind of jump straight into the threat side without understanding where things are at. You need to have a lay of the land first. And being able to do that should produce a lot better results down the road. So I just want to add that comment there for sure.
That's awesome. Just watching some of the questions come through. So knowing all range of people are joining this and looking at kind of where they're going to go next, kind of the next step that they're going to march down the path of and building their threat hunting programs. we'll do our best to try to spell out some acronyms. So the first question that's come through is kind of on the lines of, can you explain what a TTP is? We've heard it a bunch of times already. So the tactics, techniques, and procedures. And if we walk down a path of just the two things that we're looking at here from a type of threat hunt, from an environment or a threat focused, can you guys, from your time out in the field, from your time in doing this work and time working with customers, would you categorize kind of what approach you're seeing more of, a environment focused threat hunting or a threat focused hunt, and why you would say one would be more successful for an organization versus another?
Right. So yeah, typically from the fields, we've seen the threat hunt programs just jump right into the essentially. We'll kind of look at like why people are jumping into it, right? You see the media kind of throws out someone's attacking the power grid, or this facility was taken down, and we've seen that kind of propel threat hunt programs into existence, or even forward from what they're currently at into, well, we need to go find whatever that was. Right? And typically that's meant indicator sweeps if that's available, or even going so far as to say, what are the behaviors we'll be looking for? And ultimately, just trying to run those things in your environment, that's where we've seen the frustration of, great, we're going to look for this kind of behavior. We're looking for these procedures that, whatever activity group is using, and then they kind of fall flat with that because they don't know where their data is at. They don't know if they can actually go access anything, who owns what kind of systems, and they're really going through that through the first time. So ultimately, to answer that question more directly, we see folks try and go for more of the threat side. It's certainly much more flashy. It's what management cares more about from is this going to cause downtime? What are the capabilities of whoever is acting maliciously? But ultimately, groups that are going to be focused more on the environment first have way better answers to bring forward to their management when they say, we've seen this kind of behavior. It goes over, SMB. So, some sort of file movement. If you don't have those protocols, you would be okay. But again, that's coming from knowledge of the environment, understanding what systems and how they communicate with one another to better inform the threat focus. So a lot of programs focusing or trying to get to the threat side without necessarily factoring in what's on my environment first and going down that route.
Yeah, no, sorry, Tim. I'll chime in on that and say too, for threat focus, like the threat intel source that you use is really important, right? Because when you're talking about starting with TTPs, you're starting with what you think the group you're looking for is doing, right? And so part of this paper too, and the rigor part of the paper is really, during a threat hunt, you might randomly find an attacker in your network. But if you're doing a TTP or a TTP focused threat hunt, and your threat intel isn't leading you to the right data sources or to do the right analysis, you might not be successful. So, it's important to point out with threat focus, there is that threat intel element that's really important.
And while you're there, I can say I wish this was more of a town hall with open conversation and mics, but that has a whole bunch of other problems that go with it. The level of questions that we're getting, I can tell you from a time perspective, we'll have to grab all of these and get them to the two presenters, and they can follow up offline. But where we're talking about topics where these fit, can you provide some thoughts on your favorite threat intel feed? So specifically, if threat focused has a lot to do with how good, how accurate, how current the relevance of your TTPs and the intel feeds that you're getting, what are some that you would mention that you would recommend people go and pursue?
So we're obviously biased because that's one of the provided. I mean, Dragos, right? We have a threat intel team, and that's really our differentiator for Dragos on the market. So, we're biased to ours. I'll let Marc, since he's been on more hunts recently, talk through some of the other resources he might have used.
Yeah, so for me, it's less about a single resource or a single company that's doing something, looking more at the quality of the information that you're given. So yes, a lot of them are going to have indicator sweeps, but really when I start dissecting out, what other resources are out there, or as a team, we're kind of looking for things, is is it giving me enough information to sort of abstract away from specific indicators so I can make some sort of behaviors out of it, right? That's where Dragos Intel, our Intel team is going to be able to do that for us. We kind of have a collaborative nature. And ultimately, we've put a lot of open source information out there where you can actually abstract some of that sort of material in there and make those behaviors. So really it's more about the process for reviewing what you're seeing and trying to figure out, is it worth my time to now pursue whatever was given to me in a blog post or some sort of Twitter feed or whatever else it is, assessing what kind of hypotheses can I create out of this and then go from there. Ultimately, Google searching gets us a decent way just from looking at what's out there. Certainly a lot of good Twitter threads from just really knowledgeable people, and you just kind of have to start picking apart that information. So yeah, more of a methodology for looking at what you're getting, because I think companies, I think they can kind of go up or down on, is it really good intel or is it something that's going to kind of fall flat? I think that's a little bit of the nature of that. So it's just assessing what you're given and not relying on just one source of information for anything.
And we see too, if companies don't have a threat intel program, if they have a good threat intel program, we see a lot that comes out of that. If they don't have one, using open source reporting can be helpful, right? So if you're in mining, right, you might look at the groups that generally attack, mining, and there's a lot of open source material around there too that you can build that level of threat intel around without having to, go with a vendor solution that's open on the market. So I'd encourage Tim on your question too, that there's certainly a lot of information out there that you can kind of base these on top of.
Great. A couple just follow-ups on the work that Dragos does from IOC. I know there are some reports that you make available for free. I know you also have kind of an Intel feed that you sell. Can you just mention the ones that you have for free resources that people can go grab, or by registering with your organization? There are questions specifically for ICS-related IOCs and where people can get those feeds so they can add them in to their existing tool sets.
I'm actually not.
Marc,
you got it.
Oh yeah. So again, I'm driving a little bit more towards the sales side or whatever, but no, we do have a commercial Intel feed. It's not a traditional Intel feed of just run these IOCs through. It's certainly something we provide, but it's much more about the context. It's giving here's why this was fear, uncertainty, doubt from the media. Here's what what our expert Intel analysts think about what's going on. So those are the reports that we're given. I would say a resource that no one has to go and pay for is just going to the Dragos website. Actually, just went through our redesign. Our marketing team did a fantastic job. And so just going to the resource page there. All of our white papers, our activity group cards are on there, specifically noting on the activity group cards, if you get to that section, looking at the capabilities that are there, right? It kind of lifts up some of the tools that activity groups are working with. And if you want to build kind of profiles off that into your own tool sets or whatever else it is to kind of look for those, or at least to get an idea of what the coverage is, that's all on our website. So I would definitely encourage people to go look for that. And if there's a need for anything beyond that, just reach out to anybody on the Intel team, on the sales team, anything like that. We'll get you to the right place.
That's great.
Also with
definitely.
that.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
Oh no, sorry. With that too, I'd also encourage like the crash override report, the Trisis report. Any of the reports that have been put out. I know both Dragos and SANS have pretty good technical reports with things that you can action off of during a hunt. So Tim, to your question earlier, I'd also say the answer would be some of the big recent events that both SANS and Dragos have, pretty extensively done good technical reports on.
Great. Yeah, and I would recommend the activity group. I look at those as like baseball player cards for the various activity groups that are out there, with some of the stats and some of the information that you would need to know as you're starting to conduct your threat-focused hunts. Just before we move off of this topic and into next paper, reposition your questions to the studio audience in regards to more applied and conducting threat hunts as we start moving into that topic. But to summarize some of what we covered here, so in a normal world with good employee retention and good employee training and a robust threat hunting program, this kind of capitalize on home field advantage. And you should certainly know your environment better than the adversary. And adversary doing activity in your environment should be relatively easy to highlight. But in many organizations where employees are coming and going, various levels of capabilities, everybody kind of has experience with different tool sets. You end up in this strange model where adversaries are in environments, in some cases, longer than the employees who support them or manage them. So if that's your case, you would tend to move more towards a threat-focused approach. If you're still kind of normalizing and trying to gain an inventory down at your OT levels and really truly understand that environment so you can know what normal looks like. Is that sort of in line with the two different types of hunt?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it goes down to, you can do a lot of great things with baselines and with anomaly detection, but if your baselines of your anomalies are set in a contested environment, the attacker's normal is built into your normal if,
Sure.
your environment's baseline. So that's where you do really need to get to the threat focused, beyond just anomaly detection in that case.
Yeah, and that kind of moves towards, there's an interesting quote in that paper where it's on Newton's theory that every action kind of has a equal reaction. An adversary working in an environment will leave behind elements that would aid kind of a threat hunter. There's two ways of thinking about that. One is if you don't know the environment, the adversary actions now look normal to you. And the secondary piece is if you do know the environment and the adversary's actions stick out, then when you begin operating in that space, it becomes apparent to the adversary that there's somebody who's trying to counter their activity. So that theory applies both directions. So it becomes more of a chess game in a well-defended environment as well as a well-targeted environment. One piece before we exit this paper, truly, it's rigor is in the title, and we haven't mentioned the word once. So, and I think it is probably the more important framework of the paper is, can you give me just a couple of minutes on what you consider something of a mid-level to higher level rigor, meaning a company who has nothing currently and they're trying to develop a threat program, or they haven't really considered it, but they're issued an alert from their sector-specific agency telling them there's been targeting to your sector. Here are the adversary TTPs. And they go look in a small subset, or they go look in kind of their IT environment for certain adversary TTPs, or they're looking for the wrong stuff in the wrong areas of their space, and they come to the conclusion that we don't have any active infections. It's the model of you're not actively monitoring, but you can quickly determine that you're not infected. That's really where this word rigor comes. So if you could give me a couple of minutes on what you would consider a good enough level of rigor before you can make some conclusions.
Right. So, and that's good because with rigor, it really, our thoughts are, it comes down to coverage, right? So if you're out threat hunting in a refinery, right, you have the different parts of the process, the different networks. If you're in a Honeywell environment, you're talking about communities, which are basically different Active Directory domains that make up a Honeywell refining environment. And so when you talk about rigor, you might say, hey, let's start with the community that's our ops center, right? Let's look at our engineering workstations, our HMIs, the areas where, we saw in Ukraine in 2015 and in 2016, the parts that were targeted there. So the areas that you kind of expect either the attacker to be, or you expect more consequence to be if it's taken down, or if you lose access or view in that area. Not all areas of the refinery are as important, and so, right, so if you do coverage, it won't necessarily be representative of importance starting out, but you can at least say, hey, let me start with just hunting on engineering workstations for TTPs that I see there. That's one kind of rigor approach you can say of how much of the process inside my fence line and even the dependencies coming into the refinery, right? You can't refine oil without certain dependencies coming in. So, You might also threat hunt on the dependencies that come into there. On the Intel side, you can do the same deal, right? So if you do start or you have an Intel program going, you can say, okay, these are the known TTP groups that we have, and the paper walks through this a bit on some of the how we saw to even automate some of that to say, I'm going to go write a playbook, a hunting playbook, which is the steps that I'm doing to prove out the hypothesis. And ideally, that playbook maps up with these are the known TTPs of the, the known tactics of the group I'm looking at. And you can measure the coverage there to say, okay, 80% of known TTPs for this activity group, I should have covered with this step. So to your point, Tim, kind of that the combination of coverage and then saying like, hey, I'm looking for PS exec for Mimikatz for, the crash override malware used in 2016. You only know so much, but you can somewhat quantify at least coverage on what you know and you're inside your fence.
That's great. I would definitely encourage anybody who's looking for more information on specifically types of collection, the different data sources, and understanding, how you can get to a level of some acceptable level of rigor to be able to draw conclusions and have some confidence in the conclusions you're coming to. This first paper, I had sent out the URL to everybody in the entire audience via chat for the first paper, and we will move on to the second paper. And if you're out there looking at the screens that aren't changing much, don't be panicked. Again, we only have a couple of slides. We wanted this to be really more of a discussion and an opportunity to get your questions answered more than a set of 40 or 50 slides that we were going to march through. So if the screen looks frozen on your end for long periods of time, it's not because you have a technical problem. Moving on. So we're about halfway through, and we want to spend some time on this second paper, which is really kind of the applied component. So a practical model for conducting a cyber threat. And I'd sent out this URL to the entire chat group. So if you haven't received this paper, you can go find it currently. This slide we'll just kind of leave up here until we get to our last topic. But as this paper walks through kind of this six-phase, six-step model for kind of the applied practitioners out there who are going to go out and build programs and run active threat hunts in their environments, the paper kind of walks through these steps and other models that exist. And just to start the conversation, I'll have the traditional asset owner and operator skepticism hat on first, which is every time there's a new model that comes out, some of the first questions that will appear are why do we need another model? And it's generally fed by questions that'll say, there's nothing new under the sun. How did people used to do this? And I think that's an area where I thought it was important to have both of the presenters kind of walk through their backgrounds of doing this type of work for a while and doing this type of work in a variety of different sectors. And over time, coming to the conclusion that there was a lack of consistency, there was a need for some type of approach, seeing what some organizations were doing and seeing gaps and having lessons learned, and then really driving towards, we believe this type of model and this type of this type of approach is really valuable for organizations to pursue. And if you guys can walk through kind of those general questions that I know will come up in a number of the audience members' minds and participants of why did we need the model? How did people used to do it? And how does this approach help? So to Dan and Marc, I'll let you guys fight over who gets to talk first. But if you could walk through the purpose and the benefit of this.
Yeah, certainly. And I think it makes sense to even step one, we'll go one step back here and go, why did we write the paper in the first place? So when we were looking at, taking Dragos' threat hunting program, from where it was at to the next level, trying to look at any other information, were there any other companies that are doing that right, or models that we can kind of absorb and use into our own practice? It was tough, right? Looking at the OT space, going, is there something that really understands the complexities of these systems, the importance of these critical processes continuing to run? Ultimately, we got very discouraged because a lot of the models that we ended up looking at ended in, now you have to buy our product. In order to really do this well, you have to spend X amount of dollars. So well, that doesn't really help the analysts at the end of the day. So for the folks that we were working with, and even for ourselves, we wanted to be able to have a repeatable and scalable process that leads from hunting to having that automation footprint at the end of the day, or at least efficiency, at least trying to get there. So what we put together is a 6-step process, and really when you read it and we kind of talk about these things, they really end up just being very, very conversational, very discussional between the teams and the stakeholders that need to be involved with this. So I think the biggest thing, I'll just say up front, this does not end in having to buy anything from Dragos. This is complete. I mean, just use it for whatever threat hunting purposes you need to. What it should elicit is a lot of questions about your organization. A lot of times we see adopters of this in the organization are asking like, okay, so my management has asked me to threat hunt. My question should be, for what purpose? Right? We're going to look for xenotime activity as an active group. We are going to understand our system complexities, and we're going to look at our catalytic cracking unit, like what networking helps support that process. I'm kind of going down these steps. So that's the kind of the I guess where the model came from, and the purpose being to start up an organization, start a program, or take it from where it's at, make it more efficient, and really getting to that automation at the end. If you have technologies that you can use, that's where we want to start leveraging those tools and technologies to really get to the next level there. So that's kind of at least the background of that. So Tim, I'll flip it back over to you, unless you want to go deep dive into each step here, or at least do a high level, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, I think in each one of these, it's everybody listening on the phone. Again, this isn't in no case, and it's the third paper that hasn't been written as well in regards to tools, techniques, approaches. Everybody is at a different place. There's no one size fits all, and this model is really kind of trying to meet organizations where they are. So the business purpose and driving business objectives, an organization may have a key business objective for a critical asset, and then that's going to drive them into their scope, where they're going to develop a program that is specific to that part of their environment. And as they add more resources, add more capabilities, this is a continuous review of did they find value in what they did previously with a very small defined scope at a facility, and it's something that they want to expand and add to their teams and continue to fund, or do other business objectives and other areas of the business require that funding so they can't. I think these are areas where this has to be viewed by each organization to kind of walk through each one of these elements and identify kind of where they are and how they're going to scope. From my perspective, I think the purpose and scope are the two most important components, and a number of people need to be involved at the organization in defining and setting those, and then everything else will come. In this paper, there's a number of other models that are referenced, from the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain to the additional SANS kind of stage 1, stage 2 element of that kill chain, where an industrial control system component stage 2 was added to the existing Lockheed Martin kill chain to kind of add that understanding that a full compromise in the traditional kill chain on the IT OT networks to then transition into a OT side would require additional actions in an entire additional stage. But from a threat hunting perspective, the same thing applies. Kind of the scope of where you're looking, the scope of what you're trying to identify. You kind of look across a number of these models. One that's referenced highly, and especially in this community, is the diamond model. And again, just as a way to dive in more on this purpose and scope discussion, if you look at kind of the diamond model and the four vertices of that, the adversary, the victim, the capability, and the infrastructure vertices. So from an asset owner and operator perspective, if I'm looking to task resources, so technology, training, workforce, people in our environment, and determine a scope, there's some discussion in my mind of how much effort in a developing program, for example, do I put on the adversary and victim vertices. And I look at these four vertices as not being in balance. As from an asset owner and operator, if I look to those two that focus on kind of the intent of an attack, as an asset owner and operator, I'm more interested in focusing resources on the infrastructure and capability vertices it's something that I'm directly responsible for, something that I directly influence and I need to react to, versus the adversary and victim that is more geopolitical, targeting, and the intent. Can you talk just how that comes in when people are defining their purpose and scope, where you see asset owners and operators focusing versus maybe law enforcement and intelligence, and how those two should kind of lean on each other?
Yeah, so really that gets into where that purpose comes into play. And I think this is really important when we hear a lot of organizations from analysts and practitioners that are getting the just go threat hunt, right? They hear about something in the news and it's just, you'll go look for that stuff. But really breaking it down, not too terribly much, but say, this is the purpose. Let's say Dragos puts out a report about xenotime, as we have a lot of open source research about that right now. Here's business objective, the purpose being, I want to understand if this activity is currently happening in my environment. Adding on to some other things about, I want to understand how xenotime could potentially get in, or how they would maybe adapt, their current attacks to our system specifically. Lock that down as an actual purpose and objective, and then you kind of go from there. Moving through from the stakeholder perspective of, yes, we want to look at all 400 facilities that we have, or we're just looking at the OT networks or the IT networks from the stage one side. So I think to your point there, the threat intelligence side, where you're looking at on the diamond model from what attacks are actually out there, making sure that the people that are asking for the threat hunt, the ones that are pushing forward, have a very clear purpose, a clear objective of, we want to find this activity. And ultimately, the rest of the model should help take whatever's out there and craft it into something that's actually useful. So by the time you get to plan review and you're asking management, like, hey, this is the plan we have put together. It's going to take us this much time. We have this much resources. Here's our tool set. Here's what we can and can't do. Really, as a nod to the rigor paper, here's the TTPs we're going to be able to look for. Here's what we can't in our current state. And then, kind of go back and forth from there. And ultimately, that should better drive your, the management side to say, here's what we need resources into. This is the value prop of looking for xenotime activity and, for follow-on activity, building a real program that actually makes sense there. So having a better feedback loop from the analysts all the way back up to the top is really kicked off by having some of that, that activity group come into play and have new capabilities there. So
one piece that I think I was hoping we have time for, and I think even if we go a couple of minutes over on this webcast, it's going to be worth it. But one of the things I was hoping to cover, so for those who have the full web GoToMeeting up, the link for this paper has been sent out. And if you go to a section in this paper, the threat hunt model applied, it's really a walkthrough of a case study, an example case study of kind of notionally where these 6 steps of this 6-step model exist. It's brief. It's probably less than a page, but Dan or Marc, are either one of you kind of comfortable with taking maybe a minute on each section and just summarizing what steps are happening in this notional use case at each of these 6 steps? I think that'll help from an audience and participation understanding level of just how is this applied. So if you go to the threat hunt model applied component of the paper and just walk through these 6 steps, I think that'd be a good use of our time here if you're okay with that.
Yeah, certainly. So starting with purpose, purpose is, again, where I said, we don't recommend jumping directly into hypotheses, because a lot of times the way that people build hypotheses, they constrain themselves from the start. So purpose really starts with, threat hunting, it requires human resources. Sometimes it requires outside contracts we see with people. It's resource intensive. And so purpose at the end of the day is the why, right? Why are you setting out to do this? And from that why, you then get into the scope, which is the next step, which is, okay, for that, and I'm scrolling down to it. Your scope is then, okay, where are you going to look? And your scope, you start to take that purpose of why, and you start to say, okay, it's going to be this one plant, or it's going to be these plants, or it's going to be this part of the network that we know was attacked first. So in the example of the paper, we talked about a crash override attack, what happened in Ukraine, and what they did with IEC 104. And so in this example, you're talking about, okay, the purpose of my hunt might be, I want to go look for Electrum for similar tactics to what happened in Ukraine in my power generation site. And I'm going to look at things similar to what was happening with IEC 104. We've done research and also looked at doing the same IEC 104 attack in DNP3 and found similar things with DNP3. So, you're not necessarily safe just because the attack happened in IEC 104 in another place. And so when we're hunting and when we're scoping, we'll look for that too. Hey, it wasn't IEC 104 there. Here's how you do it, DNP3, and here's how you look. But scoping gets down to saying, these are the systems, this is the part of the network that I'm going to test. From there, you then generate the hypotheses. So if you're in IEC 104, DNP3, whichever, you begin to ask questions like, hey, I'm going to abuse this portion of DNP3, or I think an attacker might abuse that. You can build a threat hunt around that protocol, knowing how that protocol works and the hypotheses associated with that. The next step is then equip. And so you have those hypotheses statements. We talk a lot about the cognitive bias of Maslow's hammer. And so Maslow's hammer is basically when all you have is a hammer, everything seems to look like a nail. The reason equip is the third step and scope is number 2 is you shouldn't really think about tools when you're thinking about what you're looking at during a threat hunt. You should be saying, these are the questions I'm trying to answer going back to that purpose. And so equip is when you start to get into, these are the tools I need, whether it be something commercial, open source, or even if you have a threat hunting contractor, you work with an outside group, bringing in that outside group. From that stage, plan review is really just making sure that it meets the purpose. Funny quick story too, Marc and I over the last year year and a half teaching this, we actually were teaching a group who mentioned that at an asset owner, someone got fired over a part of a threat hunt plan that wasn't entirely legal inside of the company, and it ended up someone being canned. So plan review can even get into the legality depending on what data you're trying to collect and process, and especially when you get into the SIP environment, with third parties, when you're getting into SIP medium and SIP high data and all the protections around that. So in this case, then execute's actually doing it. And then finally, the last step that we saw important with this was that feedback step. So again, going back and saying whether it's IEC 104 and DNP3, for step 1 and 5, all the way from purpose to execute, what worked well, where do we need resources, how do we do this better, and how do we get more mature? So
I think that's very helpful. And as people read through this, it's you can pick up this paper and go straight to the section on threat hunt model applied. And if you start reading from there and you walk through these 6 elements, and then you think about what that means and how it applies to you and your organization, and say, where do we need, if we wanted to be able to receive an indicator of compromise saying, hey, the natural gas and pipeline sector is being targeted, and they're being targeted by this adversary group with these TTPs, do we have the capability to actually look in the right places for that adversary group with those TTPs? Can we consume those indicators? Can we act on it? And kind of look across the 6 step to see where your capabilities align and where they align with various adversary groups that are targeting your sector, your industry. Oftentimes, a company will come forward and talk about their capabilities and present them in a way of, we have this level of visibility, we have this level of network access control, we're doing this for antivirus, we're doing this for IDS and IPS, and a simple question of, kind of showing the Purdue model and saying, can you check the boxes for each one of those and say where you have them? And in almost all cases, they're all at the top. They're all on level 5. They're all at the corporate business enterprise network. And as you start looking at different capabilities within an organization and saying, can you check any of those boxes in level 3? for example? And do you have those capabilities down in that segment? And if the answer is no, then picking up something like this case study and saying, hey, we're going to go look for Electrum, and they're in control networks, and they're using 101 and 104. If you're looking for that in your IT environments, you're not going to find it, and you're going to come to the conclusion that therefore we have no Electrum activity in our network. So walking through this applied case study will definitely shine some light on a few things, plus a comment that Dan had mentioned, that just because you don't have any 104 or 101 activity or IEC 61850 activity in your network, that doesn't mean that adversary group isn't there. It means they use those specific protocols for a target. If they were targeting you, they would likely be looking towards what you're using, which may be DNP3 or OPC or Profinet or something different. So you'd be looking for the broader indicators from that adversary group, not just what they've demonstrated at a different target in each case. I think picking up that applied case study and looking at these 6 steps and thinking about where you are from a capability and maturity model will help. Mark and Dan, I think with the time we have remaining, I'm going to go through a couple of lightning round questions to close out this section, and then we'll go to the third and final. One, if you can just give us your thoughts on confidence in naming an adversary, meaning with reports occurring for some campaigns in the last year or two of one adversary nation state stealing tool sets from another and masquerading their attacks to make it look like it's coming from another. As you're looking to those TTPs and you're kind of trying to identify who it is with adversary groups actively trying to masquerade each other, what other things that you can safely mention would you say when we go to your adversary baseball cards that were mentioned before and you're kind of identifying activity groups, what level of confidence do you have in the legitimacy behind those activity groups, knowing that they're trying to, in some cases, masquerade?
Yeah, so I think the way that we approach that is less about thinking about the naming conventions and thinking about the attribution and where everything is at behind the scenes, and more about what are the unique TTPs that are going on here. Ultimately, we're trying to hunt, we're trying to validate in data whether something is abnormal, right? And abnormal contains all of those behaviors, the indicators. It's everything that anyone who's not supposed to be inside of critical infrastructure, anything that they're doing is what we need to look for. So kind of applying that to the activity groups to say, well, the naming conventions really don't excite me that much, but the TTPs that I'm looking for, that's when we build up our own repo of what are things that we typically look for. What are the new things that are coming in? So even if activity groups are swapping around tools, or they're borrowing things, or they're still using Mimikatz because that works, just to be able to look at those and go, okay, well, the activity group is what it is, but do I have coverage of that, right? So going back to the rigor paper of, yes, do I have coverage of these things? Am I at least getting all the TTPs, or at least trying to push that forward? So confidence inside of, are they swapping around tools, or are the activity groups themselves? Not as interested in that, focusing more on what can I actually go prove in data, because I'm not going to find a xenotime string inside of malware, inside of the raw traffic. At least I hope not. It's really focused more on what's actually happening.
Sure. So Dan, next lightning round question, and it's something that I imagine just looking at the people on this call, probably 80% of the folks would love to hear even a notional number here. Every utility, every asset owner and operator, everybody in critical infrastructure, when they're looking for additional full-time equivalent resources, they're looking for additional O&M. Capital is generally easier to obtain, but additional O&M is the holy grail and very difficult to acquire. The general question they will ask when they're asking for something is everybody's looking for benchmarking. They're saying, what is a company of our size? What do they have? What does their threat hunting program look like? What is their staff levels? What is their operating budget? What is their capital budgets? Do you have any number notional that you could say, we'll pick a mid-size utility? That way, anybody else on the phone who's a large multinational or a large utility in multi-state or small municipalities, co-ops, they could adjust the number up or down. For a mid-sized utility with a capable threat hunting program, number of people to start with, and then resources availability. To what level do they rely on outsourcing or managed services versus handling it all in-house?
So it doesn't take that many people. And so, funny enough, so I was the second. The Dragos talk 2 years ago was just Ben and I. So we were threat hunting with, a talk of a size of 2 servicing. So, I mean, it doesn't take many people to do it if you have the right skill sets, right? Which is kind of a magic, in quotes, word to say there. A lot of what we see when we're working with, even large companies, medium to large companies, is the number right now that we deal with is generally under half a dozen people. And to the point of tools, again, it's going to go into the background of those people. I mean, do they know how to use, if you don't have an O&M budget for tools, right, you're looking at using open source stuff. So are you familiar with, either the SANS toolkit that's pushed out through SANS training? Are you familiar with Network Miner, with Elk, some of the other things that, you're going to be rolling yourself if you have less of a budget? When we did the S4 detection challenge, right, a year ago at S4, which is an industry conference in Miami, it was teams of 2 people, and there was a Dragos team going against a Kaspersky team going against 2 people from asset owners. And, some of their findings, we found a lot of the same stuff. That being said, Kaspersky, obviously, Dragos and Kaspersky found a little more because we have more streamlined toolkits. But it doesn't take many people if you have the right people. But again, it's getting, the right talent, the few right talent that knows how to use either open source or closed source tools.
Awesome. Hey, Carol, I'm going to ask for your forgiveness and say we're probably going to go 5 minutes over. But let me pause here and kind of move on to this third kind of a joke, a non-paper, meaning I believe this last half of this talk, as we've been preparing for this webcast with Dan and Marc and talking about where we thought we could help the most, I believe kind of the closing component here is this people, process, and technology that's necessary for an effective threat hunting program. I think that paper needs to be written, so more of a scientific paper has already been written with a call for something better and better rigor and common language and common understanding. A paper has been written on doing threat hunting from an applied perspective. And I think this piece could really be more of a practitioner focused. What types of open source tools, what does good look like, more of a benchmarking side, and truly trying to, the way we started this conversation, that everybody's not at the same place. Everybody's not at the same capability and maturity level. And nor does every organization need to be. So this discussion along the lines of what types of tools, what types of approaches should exist and should organizations pursue. As I've thought about this for some time, in classes that we teach, people are always asking, should we be looking at specific for our OT environments? Should we be looking at network whitelisting and benchmarking of traffic and understanding what normal is? Should we be looking to behavior analytics? Should we be looking to anomaly detection? Should we be looking to a hybrid resource of all those things? And over time, the way I've talked about it, and I've kind of just, for the purpose of this discussion, built this in my mind, the way I've been thinking about it, from on the left side, you kind of have the maturity indicator level of an organization, which includes kind of funding, team size, situational awareness, meaning are they getting threat intel feeds? Are they operating in this space? What's their level of knowledge and capability? And what do their business objectives require? And then on the bottom is kind of the technical, what capabilities do you have within your OT environments to actually see data? Is it from host only? Is it from, point in time network taps? Do you have the ability to do limited network span ports on some of your industrial switches if they're managed and if the vendor allows it? Do you have a full backplane capability of capture, real-time network collection? Can you aggregate those pieces together? Do you have an integrated SOC? And ultimately, what you're discovering and operating in, are you feeding that back into operations and helping them make operational decisions if you're seeing odd, questionable traffic within the OT environment. Based on that and kind of where those all sort of apply, I took the 3 common questions that we get from a network whitelisting to a behavior analytic to anomaly detection, and I placed them on this graph. I hope we can take this and drive it into a paper with Dan and Marc and Dragos and get some industry feedback and likely create some cool graphics that we can make a poster with. But I think this third topic is an area that needs further investigation and further discussion, so people can vet it out and say, this kind of makes sense and aligns to us. But along these lines with the 2 gentlemen on the phone, if either looking to this and your feedback on it, or just what you've seen, some examples of in the field, what does good look like? Have you been into an organization where you've seen, hey, the things that you guys are doing, you don't need our help. You're way beyond, where most organizations are, from a staffing, from a training, from a tools, technology. And then on the other end, meaning you get into an organization and you're talking to them about where they start. So open source tools that you would point them to, just any feedback that you could provide on the range of different organizations and where they land. And, kind of any company, meeting them where they are, what's the next step that they should pursue, either through technology or through courses or open source, any of the above. We're kind of at time for the webcast. For those who need to leave, I appreciate you joining us, but we will stay on for a few more minutes as Marc and Dan discuss this final component.
Yeah, so certainly on this, I mean, one of the fun parts actually being on the vendor side, right, is we get to see a very wide range of programs, and we get to be involved, part of their programs, as they kind of do reach those higher maturity levels. We certainly have some asset owners that have really solid programs, but we've still found ways to kind of keep the security bar going forward. And then we've had, the extreme resource constrained programs where, security is a one-person shop and it's a shared duty with someone else, or, they were the person at the plant that knew the most about computers, and so they ended up being the security person. Definitely seen that places too. I think this is going to be an interesting paper, as it does get defined out, to your point, and earlier on the resourcing for tools. Because where you're going to start, right, is you can start with tactics. And again, going back to the Sands and the Dragos papers on Ukraine, you can start with those tactics and you can do it with open source tools. The other component of maturity, though, and really where you enter a difficult part of the industrial problem with this, is when you start getting into super proprietary protocols that a lot of the ICS manufacturers, they might not have it documented, and so you need tools for very exotic environments, right, for exotic protocols that aren't well understood. And that's where, particularly as you get up maturity, right, you're getting into more of those industrial protocols which are driving the process on the network. So I think that's another interesting thing to bring up too, with capabilities and maturity, particularly with industrial, just with how plants are constructed and how the networks work.
I'll just I'll add on top of that. Again, I echo a lot of Dan's sentiments there, but having been out to numerous sites at this point over 2 years here, a lot of times when we're coming to facilities, just asking for documentation about what inventories do you have of assets, right? How does the process actually work, right? Where are the critical points and how do things move in and out? What does a network diagram look like? A lot of those places, a lot of the facilities that we go to have either things that are very much out of date or things that don't exist at all. And trying to get a span port set up for the first time, on gear that hopefully they can actually do that, to just start getting a lay of the land. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest things, going back to the environmental hunting side of, let's just get that high level picture of what's going on. Sure, we've had a number of times where folks say, yep, our firewall config is blocking all these things, and we end up doing a network review, and we find that there are a lot of paths around the firewall. Just doing whatever. There's that awesome any rule just in the top of a beautiful rule set. that's just not doing anything. So being able to just to go in and say like, yep, we're going to start collecting data, to build a collection management framework, just to start there. And certainly there have been companies that have been able to go beyond that, and that gets to Dan's point about they're into some super proprietary stuff. They need some other things to dig deeper. But for the majority of the industry that we've seen, it's kind of their first time just grabbing some of that data or grabbing it in a different way to kind of get an operational picture. I just added that on the end.
I think you summarized some of the greatest challenges that appear in most environments is just number one, understanding the environment and the data flows so you can determine what's most important, and then getting visibility into that environment, as many environments do not have managed switches. And then from an operational reliability and safety perspective, if you have managed switches, working with the vendors to determine what's the backplane impact that would allow you to actually port span or mirror. You may be limited to capturing one or two interfaces only in some spaces. So the understanding the network flows and understanding operations so you could determine what's most important, then getting visibility to that data set, and then ultimately being able to do acquisition and response. So coming in and saying, we're going to go purchase this anomaly detection tool without first understanding the environment or ensuring that you have visibility, you may be spending a bunch of capital dollars on something that you can't actually implement. So for sure, those are the greatest challenges that many cases, understanding operations and then, enabling the ability to use some of these tools and capabilities, sort of the bottom line of this graph of whether you only have the ability to do host detection or if you can move more to the right to be able to do full capture and then real-time network collection. And that's where some of these other tools and capabilities become more interesting and valuable. On the one piece that I think I would like to mention, so there's tool sets that and platforms that you provide. Do you see people leveraging those up the stack, meaning into level 5 of the Purdue model, into their IT environments as well? Or do you see them traditionally putting your sensors and site stores kind of down in the OT environment and only leveraging the IT enterprise networks for communication paths? Or do you see sensors going into the IT environments as well, looking for TTP indicators and driving playbook actions?
We've seen some really flat networks, like flatter networks sometimes than people thought they were, and so certainly we've seen that traffic up there. And I think to your point, when you're talking about particularly correlating attacks and TTPs, right? You do want to be a little closer to where spear phishing happens sometimes, right? And when you're talking on threat behavior analytics, right? You want to be able to see those indicators of spear phishing and some of the things that happen on the IT side. So, it's certainly an area that, any comprehensive security program should kind of, exactly to your point, have coverage, and sensors all the way up there. We've mostly seen it on, flatter networks or places, as Marc said, where the drop isn't what they thought it was.
Yeah, I think at this point, I mean, from the deployments, it's all over the place. Certainly, bread and butter, focus on the OT network, right? Look at those communications in and out, and again, providing a lot of rich context alerts on those. But from the other side of having a flat network, most of the time it's a discovery of, oh wow, you're giving us a lot of IT traffic as well, which again, to Dan's point, a lot of correlation there. But we have all range of deployments at this point of any combination of that. Because really those networks are working together. There's a lot of business pieces that need to tie into the control system that we're seeing. So we would definitely want to view those pivots as much as we can.
One piece that I'll throw out, just this is the first time I've kind of put this on paper and shown this out, and already through some feedback through some of the attendees. Over to the left is the value of Intel feeds. And even if you can't get anything from your own environment, getting things from other people's environments. So Intel feeds, information sharing and analysis centers, state fusion centers, rely on companies that have some of these capabilities and they've moved over to the right. They're seeing adversary activity and they're sharing it and reporting it. Even if you don't have any of these capabilities, even if you don't have host only, there is still some place to start. by consuming those Intel feeds from other sources. Again, some were mentioned earlier, but for sure rely on ISACs and rely on fusion centers and other sources of data. So I will expand this chart one more column to the left to show non-organic data sources from your own environment, but relying on others as well. With that, I thank all of those on the call. It's been a great webcast. Dan and Mark, appreciate everything. The points of contact are listed here. And Carol, I think that wraps up everything we have to say. Thank you.